I'm going to talk you through a Part B question from the Christianity A-Level Eduqas RS paper. This is from Theme 1B and it's a question on the nature of the resurrected body. I'm going to repeat the warning that I gave on the other video when I went through the Part A question that goes with this on what the resurrection accounts teach about death, the soul and the afterlife, that students forget this bit of the specification. So go back and look at your specification for Theme 1B. It isn't just about did the resurrection happen, it's also about what does resurrection look like, what is a soul, what is the afterlife, and so on. Before I start, I'm going to give you two warnings / apologies. I have typed this up under time conditions with no notes. I am not pretending that it is perfect. I'm not pretending this is the only way to get an A star. You have 30 minutes, so I've given myself 20 minutes, including typing time, planning time rather, to type this up, but it may be a little long. I think it is above an A star, and so you wouldn't need everything here to get an A star, but I wanted to give you a really rich source of subject knowledge as well as skills. My second apology is I'm doing this from home and I have a lively toddler. So if you hear screaming, crashing in the background, nobody's being killed, it's just a lively toddler. So as I talk you through this answer, as a teacher, I know the mark scheme inside out, back to front, and you need to do the same. And so I know that in Part B's, they are looking for the following. You addressing the question. Where I do that, I'm going to highlight in yellow. They're looking for scholars, schools of thought. Where I do that, I'm going to highlight in blue. Schools of thought can be things like redaction criticism, source criticism, existentialism. This question doesn't particularly lend itself to those sorts of schools of thought, and so I have deliberately spoken about St. Paul being a Pharisee because they had a very definite approach and set of beliefs to resurrection. They believed in a bodily resurrection, which made them very different from other Jewish groups at the time, like the Sadducees. And remember that St. Paul was Jewish, and he makes a comment in, I think it's the letter to the Philippians, that he's a Pharisee. They're looking for analysis and evaluation. And so that means looking up close at the evidence that you present, setting it in context, unpacking the meaning, certainly not just writing a quote out and then moving on. What does it mean today? How is it linked to the question? Can it be interpreted in different ways? Does it reflect a particular historical context or philosophical school of thought that was popular at the time? Evidence, sources of wisdom. So these are mainly going to be your Bible passages, to be honest, for Christianity, and then language. And as I am writing, I'm constantly asking myself, can I phrase this in a way that's more likely to impress the examiner? And that's my thinking process. So I would advise you to start a Part B with a thesis statement. And this is an idea that we have shamelessly stolen from Charlotte Vardy. I will find her video on YouTube and I will put it in our A-level playlist. But we're using a thesis statement to give our view from the start, because there is a phrase in the mark scheme that talks about having clear and sustained views. I would say if you save your views and your evaluation for the final paragraph in a conclusion, that's not clear, because the examiner, bless them, is going to spend all their time trying to work out what your view is. So tell them from the beginning, be clear. It's also not sustained, is it, if it's just in the last paragraph? And so by setting out your view at the beginning and the end, that is sustained. Even better, keep referring to that view in your analysis and evaluation of every paragraph. So this is my thesis statement, and one thing I'm using it for is to link back to the question. And so I have said that the resurrected body of Jesus is clearly a physical body. So the question is about the resurrected body. I've used that phrase there. And then I end my thesis statement by saying it can be argued, therefore, that the body has spiritual elements, but it remains a body. And so I am addressing the word spiritual there. I'm also hinting at the sources of wisdom that are to come. So the fact that we know from, in particular, John's account of the resurrection when he meets St. Thomas, that Jesus has scars. That doesn't sound very much like a spiritual body. That sounds like a physical body. I also make the point that there is a link between Jesus's resurrected body and also the resurrected body that Christians can expect. And that resurrected body does have a spiritual nature, but nonetheless it is a body. So let's go to my first paragraph. And this paragraph, the source of wisdom I am using is mainly the Gospel of John. And I have not quoted at great length. I don't have the memory to do that. But what I am doing is repeatedly bringing in little clips or little snippets from that source of wisdom. So when Jesus talks to Mary straight after the resurrection, she mistakes Jesus for someone else, but she doesn't think he's a ghost. She thinks he's another physical person. So this is a piece of evidence that suggests that the nature of the body, of Jesus's body, post-resurrection, is that it's physical. So returning to my thesis statement, but also the question. In addition, not only does Mary offer us evidence that Jesus' body is physical, but as I said in my thesis statement, the fact that Thomas can touch Jesus' wounds suggests that he has a physical body. And then I unpack and explain that point a little bit further here. I then offer a counter-argument where I say, but actually, Jesus does things that physical people don't do, like walking through doors. However, I then evaluate that counter-argument. I make a judgment that it's not convincing because Jesus isn't your average physical person. He has always been a miraculous, godly being. And so when Jesus comes back in his physical body, he performs miracles, he does the miraculous, but he was always able to do that. And so there is some sense of continuity between his previous physical body and the physical body that he has post-resurrection. And here's my linking statement. So the story of Jesus' resurrection is clearly describing a physical person rather than a spiritual one. Linking with my statement at the end of my thesis statement here, and with the question. I'll just highlight the question in yellow so we can see it. So now I'm going to go to my second paragraph, and my second paragraph is very reliant on 1 Corinthians. I'm using the passages that are named on the spec. So on the spec it mentions Matthew 10:28, it mentions the Gospel accounts of John in 2021, it talks about 1 Corinthians 15 and the letter to the Philippians. So in 1 Corinthians, Paul mentions the spiritual bodies of the resurrected, and he does this contrast between physical bodies and spiritual bodies. And so it's actually quite tempting to say that St. Paul believes in a purely spiritual body, but I'm arguing against that. I'm using here some quite technical language, so disembodied existence, but also I am using some schools of thought as well. So I'm referring to Plato and I'm going to refer to the Gnostics, both of whom would argue for some kind of superior disembodied existence. So disembodied means a soul without a physical body. And for them, the idea of having a physical body in heaven would be an anathema, would be unthinkable. I've used that word deliberately to impress. However, for St. Paul, yes, the bodies in heaven are spiritual, and they are, and this is a phrase from St. Paul, at their most glorious, but they are bodies. It is an embodied existence. It is a soul within a body, so it is not purely spiritual. I then, in my analysis, start to talk about the background of St. Paul and who he is. And my scholar for doing that is N.T. Wright. And so St. Paul was a Pharisee. We know that from one of his letters. I can't remember which one, so I've skimmed over that. I think it's Philippians, but it really doesn't matter. And so it's likely that as a Pharisee, St. Paul will have believed in a physical resurrection, not a disembodied, purely spiritual existence. And the fact that St. Paul uses the word soma when he's talking about his heavenly bodies, the word soma in Greek has physical implications. It is a body like you and me have. So yes, there are certainly spiritual elements of our existence post-resurrection. And there's a nice key word there. And our bodies post-resurrection are, to quote, risen in splendour. They are imperishable. That's from a quote. They are different, but there is a physical element. I'm returning back to the question there. And then I explain this. I do lots more unpacking here from 1 Corinthians 15 that you could maybe pause your screen and read. And I raise the point that actually much of St. Paul's writings don't make philosophical sense. So the idea of a spiritual physical body is difficult to understand, but this is a faith document. And so returning to the thesis statement, St. Paul is arguing that the resurrected body is of a spiritual and physical nature. That echoes what I have said in my thesis statement and what the question is asking. I then return to N.T. Wright because I know the examiner wants to see scholars, and I'm unpacking more N.T. Wright's point that in order to understand the views of early Christians and St. Paul about resurrection, you have to look at the Jewish background. And the Jewish background is not consistent. So the Sadducees didn't believe in any kind of resurrection, physical or spiritual. But where there are ideas about resurrection, so the book of Job, the book of Daniel, for example, it is a bodily resurrection. And so if we want to understand the Pauline understanding, use that word deliberately to show off, we have to appreciate his Jewish heritage and that he's likely to be talking about a resurrected spiritual body, but it's not a disembodied existence. The idea of the body, the physical nature, is important. And so I link back to the question here and the idea of a rejuvenated physical body. Again, look at the key terms I'm using here. So words like grace, spiritual, disembodied. You know, I'm really trying to pull the stops out when it comes to using religious language. I'm now running out of time, but I wanted to get in another scholar, and so I'm referring to Irenaeus, and he links with St. Paul, and he talks about the raising of flesh, which is very, very relevant to our essay. So I've squeezed it in, and then I have linked back to the thesis statement and question by talking about the resurrected body being a spiritual, physical body. And then very quickly, I have returned to the question in my conclusion and ended with, our bodies are not solely spiritual, but we will have a miraculous body that has a spiritual impact. And that links beautifully with my thesis statement and the evaluation that has run through my answer, but also directly addresses the statement, which is the resurrected body is a spiritual body.